For the past 7 years, the staff and students involved in the Sanford Fallen Veterans Project have honored Sanford soldiers who served their country and gave the ultimate sacrifice. What began as one man's dream to keep their memories alive with banners hung throughout Sanford and Springvale has blossomed into a project that honors them with song, speeches, books, and flowers at their grave sites. To date, this project has honored all of Sanford's fallen from World War I to the present. Students from grade 4 and 5 have raised over $23,000 to help fund the banners. 7th and 8th grade band members have composed songs for each soldier, have worked with the horticulture program at the Technical Center and Miss Nason's STEM program at the middle school to create planters and clean grave sites in local ceremonies prior to decorating them with the plants. Military markers have been ordered and placed for those without one. The middle school band members played taps at the close of each visit. Students in digital design at Sanford's Technical Center have been involved in designing the banners, creating booklets about Sanford's fallen, and creating programs for the ceremony in the spring. They have also designed, built, and dedicated a World War I memorial at the Southern Maine Veterans Cemetery in Springvale. 2 ongoing projects involve interviewing veterans about their experiences and publishing booklets about Sanford's fallen. Prior to COVID's interruption, Sanford Junior High School's 7th and 8th grade band, jazz band, and 6th, 7th, and 8th grade chorus joined Mr. Joe Doran presenting the annual Fallen Veteran Ceremony. One of our first soldiers studied was Ralph Hansen, who served in World War II. His story was poignantly captured by the soldier who accompanied his body home for burial, Captain Lawrence Phelan. At our ceremony in 2019, David Parent gave a dramatic reading of that story. To honor all of those lives given for us, we would like to show you this story again and ask that you keep our fallen veterans in your hearts and memories today. Thank you.
A gray, watery dawn was breaking over the bleak buildings of the Brooklyn Army Base when I reported there for a new and unaccustomed duty. I was taking a soldier home, a soldier who was incapable of finding his own way, incapable of speech, incapable of action. A soldier who had given his life for his country and was on the last lap of his melancholy journey to his native and beloved Maine. I was a military escort for one of America's returning war dead. I went to the briefing room where I received my envelope of papers in the musset bag containing an extra flag, a black armband, and blank ammunition. A dozen or so enlisted men were there before me of various grades, all serious, all quiet, examining their papers to make sure they were in order. I noticed that the men, although in fact none had made fewer than 5 trips, were still grave and meticulous. This was a job that couldn't become routine, that would lose none of its significance, no matter how often repeated. This would be our proudest duty. My envelope gave me little information that I hadn't already known. First Lieutenant Ralph Hansen, Springvale, Maine. I looked at the map on the wall. Springvale was hard to find, even in a state where a town of 5,000 was considered a city. Lieutenant Hansen was a stranger to me. After one final check with the officer in charge, I signed a receipt for the remains. Lieutenant Ralph Hansen was now my sole responsibility. We drove to Grand Central in convoy, arriving at 8 o'clock, 2 hours before train time, but no one complained about hurrying up and waiting. This was a time when no train must be missed, when no error, no alibi could cover a mistake. We descended to the main station to exchange our government transport requests for tickets. Here, for the first time, I felt the full poignancy of my mission when the New Haven railroad agent handed me one round-trip ticket between New York and North Berwick, Maine, and one one-way ticket. Lieutenant Hansen was going home for good. At the baggage room, I presented the one-way ticket to the baggage master, who gave me a check and a tag to be affixed to the head of the flag-draped outer case. I found the proper case, and I checked the name, rank, serial number, and destination. They all agreed. Slowly, the coffins were lowered to track level and rolled forward along the track to the baggage car. I walked behind Lieutenant Hansen and watched the railroad men as they lifted him aboard. They had done this before. I went to the closest seat in my train to my companion, and I picked up the morning paper as the train pulled out. Buried deep in the back pages was a small item stating that the United States Army transport Barney Kirschbaum would be arriving in New York the following day with 2,530 more war dead. That brought the total return to nearly 42,000. The task was less than 1/6 finished. The Connecticut landscape, fresh with spring and drenched with driving rain, rolled by. Drowsy, I wondered about my charge in the forward car and tried to picture what he had been like. Sometimes his face was that of one of my own friends, officers and men who had died in Africa or Sicily and were possibly on the last phase of their long voyage home. And sometimes I pictured myself, mute and unseen, in the flag-draped casket, while Lieutenant Hansen sat in this seat and mused over my identity. It was only a thing called chance. And this thought, more than almost any other, gave me a strong sense of kinship with the lieutenant whose luck had gone the other way. There, but for the grace of God, go I. At Boston South Station, I supervised the removal of Lieutenant Hansen's casket for transfer to North Station. I went to North Station alone by truck, save for the driver and Lieutenant Hansen. His presence I felt throughout the trip, the more eloquent by its silence. In fact, as we boarded the Boston and Maine train, I had dropped his military title and was thinking of him as Ralph. In 2 hours' time, we would arrive in Springvale and North Berwick, just a short drive to Springvale, his hometown. The train made several stops. At each one, I went into the baggage car, and I stayed there until the train pulled out again. At Dover, New Hampshire, just a few minutes from our final destination, I moved into the baggage car to be ready to supervise upon arrival at North Berwick. I was the sole representative to the family and friends of Lieutenant Ralph Hansen, of the United States Army, the government, and the people of the nation for whom he'd sacrificed his life. The train whistle sounded its nostalgic call for crossing, and I felt the pull as the train slowed for the stop. This, I thought, is not just happening to me. Across the width and breadth of this country, in large cities and suburbs in small villages and towns, at tiny whistle stops, across the vast spiderweb of rails that span the mountains, valleys, and prairies of our land. This is being reenacted almost daily. The train had barely stopped when 6 men wearing American Legion caps climbed aboard to carry Ralph Hansen to the car that was waiting for him. The funeral director approached me. "I'd like you to meet Lieutenant Hansen's family," he said. I met his wife, Betty, first, a serene, handsome young woman whose indomitable character showed in the lines of her face where grief had struggled to take possession. As the procession wound over the rolling green hills of Maine, I got the first glimpse into my charge's background. The driver told me, he said, "Ralph was a fine boy, one of the best-liked fellows around here. It was a real sad day in Springvale and Sanford when the news came that he'd been killed." "Where did it happen?" I asked. "South of France, it was. In September, October of 44. He was in a tank battalion, I think they called it, and his Jeep got hit by one of those mines. You know, Ralph had fought all through Africa and Italy, and he got hit once, but he went right back when he got out of the hospital." We came into the town of Sanford, of which Springvale is a part of. It's an old town, dignified and quiet, with large houses, large trees, and spacious lawns. As typical of Maine as oven-baked beans. As typical of America as the people who make it up. Hard-working, industrious, honest people who are conscious of their heritage. Those on the street paused and watched as our procession passed. At the funeral home, I stood at attention at the head of the casket as Ralph Hansen's family came in. Now his mother wept. Not bitterly and not hysterically, but from a heart that was too full to contain her tears. They stayed for a few moments after that, and after they left, I consulted with the funeral director, Mr. Carl. I asked about hotels. "No hotels in Springvale," he said. "There's one over to Sanford. But Ralph's brother and his wife, they'd like you to stay with them. They live right nearby in Alfred, and they have lots of room." "That's very nice of them," I replied. "But our instructions are very explicit. We're to help out the family as much as we can, but should stay out of the way and should not be a burden on them." Well, my explanation was worthless when Ralph's older brother Carl came back. "My wife and I have planned on having you with us until after the funeral. And my 2 boys, they expect to find you at the breakfast table." That evening, before retiring, I sat with Carl and Harriet. You know, Mr. and Mrs. and Captain just sounded too formal in such a homey atmosphere. We were eating homemade cake and talking. They showed me pictures of Ralph, a handsome second lieutenant with a square jaw and a winning smile, fresh out of officers' school at Fort Knox. Then there was a picture of him with Betty, whom he'd met when they were both in college, taken after their marriage in Fort Knox. We talked for an hour or two, mostly about Ralph, about the things he enjoyed, like eating clam cakes and boiled lobster, and hiking and lake swimming. We talked about his enthusiasm for building and architectural drawing. Before he enlisted, Ralph had taught high school up in Bangor, and in the short time he was there, he had built up the manual training shop to an important department of the school. He had been a popular teacher, too, and they had held the position open for him. He was going places after the war. I went to bed thinking about young dreams, young ambitions, shell bursts, and oblivion. The next morning, I had breakfast with the two boys, Teddy, 9, and Earl, 5. They accepted me as a friend of Uncle Ralph's, and as such, a friend of theirs. They were bright, talkative, and inquisitive. They both thought they'd be soldiers when they grew up. That day, we concluded most of the plans for the funeral, and I met many more of Lieutenant Hansen's friends and family. I'd often heard of the reticence of state of Mainers. It applies, perhaps, to their control of emotion and deference to others. It does not apply to their friendliness and hospitality, which are boundless. The funeral was the following day at 2 o'clock. The chapel where Lieutenant Hansen lay, surrounded by banks of flowers and colors of the flag, was filled with friends and with representatives of the American Legion. The 2-day rain had stopped when we left the chapel, and we marched the half-mile to the cemetery through the streets of Springvale. I preceded the hearse, and Ralph's boyhood friends walked behind. The sun glimmered momentarily as the bugler sounded taps, and Lieutenant Ralph Hansen slowly sank to his final resting place. The flag, which I presented to his wife, was just a symbol. A few square yards of colored bunting. But I felt, as I was handing her, the gratitude of a nation. The rain had started again when I returned to North Berwick, and it slashed against the windows of the coach as we slid rapidly towards Boston. As I looked backward over my trip, my strongest thought was that I had made several friends, not the least of whom was one whose voice I would never hear.